We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
From the moment Good Times hit the air in 1974, it made television history. It brought a working-class black family into America's living rooms with warmth, humor, and heart. Jimmie Walker's J.J. Evans became an instant sensation. However, while audiences laughed, there was another story playing out behind the cameras, a story of clashing visions, backstage tension, and missed opportunities. For years, whispers surrounded what really happened on set, secrets, tensions, and decisions that changed the show forever. Now, after decades of silence, Jimmie Walker finally reveals what most fans missed about Good Times. This isn't simply a nostalgia trip. It's a candid look at how a groundbreaking show nearly lost its soul. What you're about to hear may completely rewrite the story you thought you knew. When Good Times premiered in February 1974, it arrived quietly, a half-hour sitcom about a black family living in a Chicago housing project. Few expected that this show, spun off from Maude, would leave an indelible mark on American television and culture. Conceived by Eric Monti and Mike Evans and developed by Norman Lear, the show aimed to give voice to the experiences of working-class African-American families. But almost instantly, it became more than just another sitcom. It was a lightning rod, a cultural flashpoint, a phenomenon. Central to this explosion was Jimmie Walker's portrayal of James J.J. Evans, Jr., lean, expressive, with an energy that seemed to burst through the screen. His comedic timing, exaggerated body language, wide-eyed expressions, and booming delivery of "Dynamite" turned a catchphrase into a pop culture landmark. Merchandise, interviews, parodies. JJ was everywhere. But behind the curtain, the fame came at a cost. While fans adored JJ and tuned in week after week to watch him crack jokes, Walker was already feeling the dissonance between what was happening on camera and what was happening behind it. The audience loved JJ, he later said, but behind the scenes it was a whole different story. What viewers didn't see was a growing rift, not just between cast members, but between the show's original vision and the direction it was rapidly taking. JJ's comedic persona began to eclipse the deeper, more serious elements the show had initially promised. And as Walker's star rose, so did the tensions, with castmates and with the creative team, who felt the show was slipping away from its roots. To many watching at home, Good Times seemed like a mirror to reality. The cramped South Side apartment, the mother's firm wisdom, the father's stern love, the children's struggles. But for Jimmie Walker, that realism was a well-crafted illusion, and the writing staff was at the heart of the problem. There were no black writers. None, he recalled bluntly. This wasn't just about missed hiring opportunities. It was a structural flaw that seeped into every script. The people crafting the dialogue and shaping the plots often had no first-hand understanding of the lives they were trying to depict. Walker described the scripts as shallow caricatures, a whitewashed interpretation of black family life filtered through a lens of suburban detachment. They hired white writers who knew nothing about the black experience. It wasn't malicious, but it was ignorant. They were guessing at things that needed truth. In place of complexity, the writers leaned into safe humor, sitcom tropes, and exaggerated personalities. The jokes were abundant, but the authenticity was draining away. John Amos, who played James Evans Sr., and Esther Rolle, who portrayed matriarch Florida Evans, pushed back fiercely. Both had theatrical backgrounds rooted in realism and were committed to representing the dignity and strength of black families. They were deeply disturbed by the tonal shift. Walker remembered them walking out of table reads. They wanted more stories about the realities of poverty and family resilience, not just JJ dancing around for laughs. Despite repeated efforts to steer the show back to its original mission, the disconnect between writers and performers grew wider. Walker recalls going to producers with concerns, "This isn't how it works in our communities." But 9 times out of 10, nothing changed. The actors weren't just delivering lines. They were fighting a losing battle to tell the truth. To the millions watching from their living rooms, Good Times projected the image of a loving, unified household. But behind the studio lights, Jimmie Walker describes a cold and uncomfortable reality. The chemistry that made the Evans family beloved on-screen didn't translate off-screen, especially once JJ became the breakout star. Walker's rise was meteoric, but the success drove a wedge between him and his co-stars. Esther Roll strongly objected to the growing reliance on JJ's over-the-top comedy, seeing it as a betrayal of the show's original mission. In interviews and behind the scenes, she voiced concern that JJ had become a stereotype, loud, foolish, disconnected from the show's initial depth. John Amos was equally vocal. He had always advocated for Good Times to reflect real-life challenges and not shy away from meaningful storytelling. Walker remembers the tension growing with each JJ-centric episode. As network executives leaned into the ratings goldmine, the set lost its sense of camaraderie. There was no hanging out. It was strictly business, he said. Even in scenes that portrayed a close-knit family, the silence behind the scenes told another story. There was no laughter between takes, no bonding. Just the professionalism of actors doing their jobs, then going their separate ways. They didn't like the direction the show was going, and I was the direction. He never blamed them, but the emotional distance and creative isolation were real. Despite being the center of the show's popularity, Walker often felt like an outsider in the very family he was supposed to be part of. At its inception, Good Times carried a powerful purpose. It was meant to be more than a comedy. It was a platform to depict a reality often ignored on television. The early seasons balanced humor and social commentary, tackling issues like systemic racism, unemployment, and public housing. But as the show's ratings soared, Walker says the network began chasing laughs instead of meaning. JJ's comedic presence became the centerpiece, and the show's emotional depth began to fade. Scripts were increasingly shaped around punchlines and slapstick. Subplots replaced substance. Entire episodes were rewritten to give JJ more screen time, but the heart of the show was slipping away. For Walker, the transformation was bittersweet. His character was a hit, but the soul of Good Times was getting lost. Before he ever became JJ, Jimmie Walker was already an accomplished stand-up comic. In the clubs, he was quick, sharp, and in full control. On stage, he was writer, director, and performer. But on the set of Good Times, that creative freedom vanished. I was told, stick to the script, he said. No room for improv. Even when he saw ways to improve a joke, he wasn't allowed to make changes. Most of the zingers he was known for weren't his. They were written by others, often people unfamiliar with black speech and humor. It wasn't me up there, Walker admitted. It was their version of me. That dissonance, being praised for something that didn't feel like his own, took a toll. Over time, the suppression of his voice wore him down. He wasn't just losing jokes. He was losing ownership of his identity. Despite the constraints, there were moments when the sitcom's mask cracked and real emotion broke through. One scene following the death of James Evans, where Florida slams a dish and yells, "Damn, damn, damn," wasn't played for laughs. It was raw grief. The audience didn't expect it. Neither did Walker. Watching Esther Roll's performance, he realized what the show could have been. Another powerful moment saw JJ being kicked out by Florida for his growing irresponsibility, a scene that stunned the live audience into silence. These rare episodes proved the show's capacity for depth and truth. But those moments were few. The network always returned to safe comedy. Yet they lingered in viewers' memories, glimpses of what Good Times might have been. As JJ's popularity grew, so did resentment on set and beyond. Walker's fame became a double-edged sword. He was the face of the show, but behind the scenes, his success created friction. He remembered the chill on set as scripts were rewritten to feature him more prominently. It wasn't personal, it was about imbalance. One day, a crew member, frustrated with Walker's growing influence, snapped, invoking Esterol's authority, "You've got to respect her. She was a man in this industry before most men were." It wasn't an insult, it was a tribute to her strength. But the message was clear. Walker's rise had disrupted the balance, and the tension couldn't be ignored. When Good Times quietly aired its final episode in August 1979, there was no celebration, no send-off. Just silence. Walker said, "It felt like being cut off mid-sentence. There was no rap party. No final group hug. The unity was gone." Esther Roll had returned reluctantly, and John Amos never came back. The final season felt disjointed, the characters emotionally disconnected. The cast barely spoke off camera. When the show ended, there was no sadness, just relief. Everyone was done. Not because they hated the show, but because the tension had become unbearable. In reruns, Good Times achieved classic status, but the people who built it rarely looked back. The emotional scars were too deep. For Walker, it felt like leaving the stage in the middle of a joke. Now, decades later, Jimmie Walker reflects on Good Times with reverence, frustration, and hard-earned clarity. He believes the show missed a profound opportunity to tell real, nuanced stories about black families beyond just punchlines and poverty. To him, Good Times wasn't just another sitcom. It was a cultural moment, a chance to break stereotypes and offer something authentic in an era when representations of black life on television were still rare and often one-dimensional. And for a brief period, it actually did that. The early seasons of the show balanced humor with meaning. It showed a black family navigating real-life struggles, financial hardship, systemic racism, raising children in public housing, not as victims or caricatures, but as people with pride, values, flaws, and love. But that version of Good Times, Walker argues, was slowly chipped away by the weight of its own success. The more the ratings rose, the more the network leaned into the safest, most profitable parts of the formula. And unfortunately, that formula became centered around him. JJ, the comic relief, the clown, the guy with the catchphrase. The laughter came easy, but the respect came slower, and the resentment came quickly. Even as his character became the face of the show, Walker felt more disconnected than ever from the creative process and the family dynamic on screen. It wasn't just tension with the cast. It was a broader frustration with an industry that too often reduced complex realities to bite-sized gags. Walker now sees Good Times as a symbol of what happens when a show with purpose becomes hijacked by the very systems it was trying to challenge. He doesn't shy away from acknowledging his own role in that shift. He knows that JJ became a phenomenon. That catchphrase put him on magazine covers, launched appearances on The Tonight Show, and even made him a pop culture icon. But it also boxed him in. JJ became bigger than the show, and the show became smaller than its original mission. "The problem wasn't that I was funny," Walker has said in recent interviews. "The problem was that funny became the only thing they wanted." Behind the scenes, that imbalance triggered something deeper. It created a silent fracture not only among the cast, but within the show's DNA. Esther Roll and John Amos had fought hard to keep the show grounded, to represent the quiet strength and intelligence of black parents who, even under crushing pressure, protected their families and upheld their dignity. They weren't against comedy, but they were against reducing everything to it. Their frustrations weren't just artistic, they were personal. They saw JJ becoming a symbol of buffoonery, a stereotype that reminded them of minstrel shows and coon characters from earlier decades of American entertainment. That wound ran deep, especially for actors like Roll, who had spent her entire career fighting to elevate black voices in serious, meaningful ways. For Walker, being caught in the middle was emotionally exhausting. He didn't set out to undermine the show's integrity. He wanted to bring joy. But joy alone wasn't enough. He remembers feeling isolated, unsure whether he was the problem or the scapegoat. There were days when the cast barely looked each other in the eye, and scenes that should have felt like family moments were filmed in complete silence off camera. The studio audience heard the laughs, but they didn't hear what happened in the quiet between takes. There was no bonding, no camaraderie, just actors showing up, saying their lines, and going home. And then it ended. Without fanfare, without closure. A show that had meant so much to so many people just stopped. It wasn't just that we didn't say goodbye, Walker said. It was that we didn't get to say goodbye. There was a collective fatigue, a sense that everyone had outgrown the show and didn't know how to say it. And so it ended, not with a bang, not with a powerful final message, but with a slow fade to black. In the years that followed, Good Times became one of the most frequently syndicated shows in television history. Entire generations grew up watching reruns, quoting JJ, and remembering the theme song by heart. But Walker noticed something troubling. While the show lived on in nostalgia, the deeper issues it once tried to tackle were often forgotten. Most people remembered Dynamite, but fewer remembered the episodes that dealt with police brutality, unemployment, or institutional inequality. The loudest moments had drowned out the most important ones. Walker's post-Good Times career was shaped by that legacy. He continued working in stand-up and appeared in other shows and films, but he was always JJ first. The industry couldn't see past that. Offers for serious roles were rare, and attempts to pivot were met with skepticism. He wasn't just typecast, he was frozen in time. "I became a caricature of a character that wasn't even mine to begin with," he once said. "They wrote the jokes. I just said them." And while audiences laughed, the man behind the laughter was wrestling with something deeper, an identity crisis shaped by a role that both made him and unmade him. He also points out something else often overlooked, the pain of being the star without the power. He might have been the face of the show, but he had little say in how it evolved. He wasn't in the writer's room. He wasn't consulted on story arcs. He wasn't even allowed to improvise his lines. He was expected to show up, say what was on the page, and keep the ratings up. And while his popularity was being used to sell merchandise and boost viewership, he was being quietly blamed for the show's creative decline by the very people who were writing it that way. That contradiction, that fame could feel like punishment, has followed Walker for decades. And as time passed, he began to reflect more critically on what Good Times could have been. It could have evolved. It could have deepened. It could have become a show that stood side by side with the greats, All in the Family, Mashka, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. But instead, it plateaued, and eventually it faded out. What pains Walker most isn't the missed career opportunities or even the personal fallout. It's the sense of cultural loss. He looks back now and sees a show that could have truly shifted the conversation about how black families were portrayed on screen. It had the talent, the platform, the reach. But it didn't have the patience or the courage to stick with the harder stories. He believes it could have taught future writers, directors, and executives how to blend comedy with conscience. But instead, it became an early example of what happens when network pressures win out over narrative integrity. There were attempts over the years to revisit Good Times, TV reunions, interviews, anniversary retrospectives. But they always felt strained. The wounds hadn't fully healed. The cast rarely appeared together, and when they did, the conversations were often cautious. Everyone had moved on, but the unresolved tension still lingered. Walker admitted that some things were never talked about, that maybe they never would be. Too much time had passed, too many things had gone unsaid. And yet, despite all the disappointment and disillusionment, Walker doesn't hate the show. In fact, he's grateful for what it gave him. It launched his career. It connected him to millions. It made him part of television history. But more than anything, it gave him a front-row seat to a painful, vital lesson about representation, what it means, what it costs, and what's at stake when it's mishandled. He knows now that Good Times was both a gift and a cautionary tale, a show that lit the way and then dimmed its own light. As he continues to reflect, he doesn't want sympathy, he wants understanding, not just of his experience, but of the broader issues it represents. The lack of black voices in writers' rooms, the industry's quickness to commodify culture, the way success can isolate rather than elevate. For Walker, these aren't just stories from the past, they're ongoing struggles in modern television. And he hopes that by sharing his truth, maybe someone else can carry the torch further than he was allowed to, because Good Times was more than a show. It was a chance, a window, a moment. And what it gave audiences laughter, what it could have given, what it almost gave was something far greater. Something real. Something lasting. And maybe that's the true legacy, not just what Good Times was, but what it nearly became. It had all the ingredients to change television forever: talented actors who understood the gravity of what they were doing, a groundbreaking premise that centered a black family with depth and love, and a platform big enough to reach into millions of homes across the country. In an era still reeling from civil rights struggles and cultural shifts, Good Times could have been the definitive portrait of resilience, of love in the midst of hardship, and of what it truly meant to be black and working class in America. For many, it still was. There are those who grew up watching Florida Evans lay down the law with compassion and strength, who saw their own mothers in her unwavering moral compass. There are those who saw James Evans Sr. as the blueprint for black fatherhood: firm, no-nonsense, protective. And even JJ, for all the controversy his character stirred, gave kids someone to laugh with, someone who seemed larger than life yet familiar. Good Times wasn't meaningless, it mattered. It mattered then, and it still matters now. But what haunts Jimmie Walker, and what should haunt the industry, is how that meaning was diluted. The show became a victim of its own success, reshaped by ratings and marketing and executives chasing the next big laugh. The complex layers that made Good Times so unique were peeled away slowly, until what remained was something far more digestible for mainstream audiences, but far less authentic for the people it was supposed to represent. Walker has spent years wrestling with that duality. On the one hand, he's proud. He knows the impact Good Times had, especially for black audiences who, for one of the first times, saw a family on TV that looked like theirs. But he's also honest about the cost. The tension, the compromises, the loss of voice. The moments where truth was traded for catchphrases. The fights that happened in dressing rooms and writers' rooms. The silence that filled the spaces where collaboration once lived. He believes that if Good Times had been allowed to grow, if its creators and cast had been trusted to tell deeper stories, it could have sparked a new standard for representation. It could have paved the way not just for more shows with black leads, but for stories that didn't flinch away from reality. It could have shown poverty without shame, family without cliché, and blackness without filter. Instead, it served as a blueprint for what not to do. A reminder of how quickly creative power can be taken from those meant to wield it. A case study in what happens when network control stifles cultural truth. And yet, even now, all these years later, Good Times continues to inspire. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real enough, often enough, to leave a mark. Those few episodes that dug deeper, those rare scenes where the emotion cracked through the sitcom formula, are still talked about today. They are remembered. They are felt. They prove that the show's potential was never lost, it just wasn't fully realized. That, perhaps, is the most powerful part of its legacy. Not just the laughter, not just the catchphrases, but the unrealized dreams that now serve as a call to action for today's storytellers. Good Times walked so others could run. It exposed the ceiling. It lit the spark. And in doing so, it ensured that the next generation wouldn't have to start from scratch. They'd start from experience, from lessons, from the echoes of what almost was. Because Good Times was more than entertainment, it was a warning, a gift, a challenge, and a reminder that sometimes The most important stories are the ones we never got to finish,